Welcome to part 2 in our Rate My Tune series, and today we have another contender, which is a Mazda MX-5 or Miata, or however you want to call it. And this is basically a relatively stock car which has a few NA mods, so higher compression, as well as an Exhintake mod which on the 1.6 should gain you about 5 to maybe 8 horsepower, as the cam on the 1.6 intake versus exhaust are quite different. We also have some different stuff here compared to the first tune. We have a dyno graph, we have a log file, and we also have the tune. We're first going to look at the dyno graph. As I said, this is a stock, or basically a stock car, and this is the dyno graph of it. Well, it is making 105 horsepower at the wheels, I'm guessing, because this is a 1.6 NB, so it's making 110 stock, so 105.6 should be at the wheels, and 128 should be at the engine, which is pretty good actually for a 1.6 NB engine. So yeah, the NA engines tend to make between 115 and 120. We had one that had 250,000 kilometers on it that still made 121 with an intake and an exhaust, so that's pretty good. So 128 in a base 110 horsepower configuration is probably going to be pretty nice. Also, that's gonna be more fun than the stock 110 or so horsepower that you are getting. Looking at the log, we're first gonna open Mega Log Viewer. So we have a first thing I am noticing is that the KPA values, so the map value, is pretty spiky. So I would suggest looking at the intake manifold if the map sensor is connected on the correct port, because on the MX-5 there is an issue if you connect it to a port that is very close to a single runner, then this happens, or when you set it to instantaneous all the time, the map sampling method all the time, then also that can happen. On some ECU that's unavoidable, but on most you can set it to a different or two different states. We also have AFR here, so this should be on, I'm gonna see what we are TPS wise. So this is going to be pretty much at cruise, maybe. Yeah, that's at cruise. Yeah, 14.3. That looks pretty good. As for cruising wise, the issue is here, as you can see also here, even in cruising with the map value, it's pretty flaky and pretty spiky, and you don't really want that, as this is also causing which also causes the ignition advance to fluctuate a lot. In this case it's not too bad, as the variance between the cells isn't too high, so that might be fine, but it can cause a lot of variance, and also variance in the VE values. If you look at the VE, you can also see the VE fluctuates quite a lot, which can lead to very flaky AFR values. As you can see here, the AFR line is quite flat, so it's not as bad as it could be, but still it's something you should be maybe concerned about and have a look at what this issue is causing actually. Looking at a pull on the full throttle, we have a one right here. Here you can see also the massive issues we have with map reading. It's going down to like, I don't know, 93, 91. So it's between 91 and above 100, which is even impossible on a NA engine. So this means you are probably also going to lose some power sometimes. And as you can see here, when the map value drops down quite drastically, we are going to drop from 104 VE to 83. So this can also create some lean spots, which in a naturally aspirated application isn't that bad, but in a turbocharged application could be detrimental to the engine. Looking at the AFRs on this pull, or maybe on the first pull that's a bit longer, we can see that the AFR is for an NA application pretty good, 13.5. That may be a bit lean for the MX-5 engine. It gets better though at about 6,200 RPM, which is where you actually want to get the engine a bit richer to help with cooling or help with EGTs, although on an NA application that usually isn't a problem. As far as I'm concerned, the logs look pretty good. As I said, the worst issue is the one with the map values being kind of flaky and being kind of an issue. I think so. He didn't mention anything that particular to me, so I'm just gonna go off of that there is no other issues particularly in this tune. Speaking of tune, we are going to look at that now. We are going to look at the settings one after the other, just as we did with the other tune. So first of all, the engine constants, which is where we also find the map sampling method. Rec fuel should be good. I think he's using stock injectors, which might be maxed out by now, but you'll definitely have to check the duty cycle. It could possibly be that the stock injectors are maxed out because I had that same issue with an NA car or an NA Miata that had a few NA modifications, and those injectors were pretty much maxed out. And at the bottom we can see the map sample method is set to instantaneous all the time. I would recommend going with cycle average, but map sample switch point, set that to like 3000 RPM. That would be a better option to get the throttle response at low RPMs good, but also get rid of that flakiness up top where you are like seeing those spiky map values. Looking at injector characteristics, injector duty limit 90%. As I said, you might be already hitting that, but just look at the duty cycle. Also, I can look at that in the log, maybe. Yep, it's hitting 90%, like here, for example, but that's more like because of the flaky map value. So you might have a bit of room, but I would suggest upgrading injectors soon if you do not have any, well, if you have plans to do further mods to the engine. Good. Otherwise, trigger setup should be fine. Again, trigger angle needs to be determined by the with a timing light. 209 seems kind of weird. I would check that because I've never seen a value like this on an MX-5 or Miata, even on a 36-2 trigger wheel. It's usually like 60 degrees or 300 or something. So maybe check that out and retime it with the timing light. Skip revolutions if you have trouble starting, so if it isn't starting all the time, kind of doing weird stuff when starting, set this to skip revolutions 1, and then it may take longer to start, but it will always start the same, it will always reliably start, because on 0 it may kind of do some hiccups or whatever, and when you skip one cycle it will cleanly have the signal of the second cycle basically. Trigger edge rising, yeah, that's all fine if the car is running. Acceleration enrichment, we have that same thing here, and yeah, that seems pretty good. Again, this might be needed to adjust so that there is more enrichment, but if you have good throttle response, leave it like that, then it should be fine for you. Other options seem fine. The taper start and end seems a bit high. I would suggest rather using 33,000 and like 4,500 because you don't need acceleration enrichment on high RPMs. The volume of fuel is enough so that it is not needed. As for the DFCO, I would set that fuel cutoff to like 1800 or something, so that when the RPM is dropping and getting close to your idle RPM, for example on high idle when the engine is still cold, it will resume fuel and the drop in RPM isn't as harsh, so the car will be able to cope with that much better. Cutoff delay 2 seconds, yeah, I think that's for the pops and bangs, which I have seen in the ignition table already. IFR O2, there is no correction setup. I always want to or like to set up a correction, because if you, for example, are going to do a road trip and drive in some mountains, this might be, yeah, it might be a good idea to enable that, because on a mountain road or on higher altitudes, the car will not reach the full 100 kPa value of at sea level, and therefore will reach a different VE value, which might not be tuned exactly to be under full load or have the correct fueling under full load. So from 500 RPM, so that is always active, and yeah, 15% is fine. So I would always suggest that this is set to PID. Engine protection, well, this fine, although if you had set up some engine protection, this wouldn't make much sense, because this would be the protection limiter, which should be set like at 3000 or something. But if there's no oil pressure protection or something set up, that doesn't make sense to, or doesn't matter much to set that up. Rev limiter, the software rev limiter should be set 100 RPM or so below the fixed rev limiter. Looking at the VE table, it looks pretty good to me. This was probably tuned with auto-tune plus some manual adjustment. Looks pretty good. The step between 86 kPa and 90 kPa might be a bit high, but if it works like that, it's gonna be fine. It's very smooth. So you can see there's not many bumps or so in here. Usually the VE table is going to be a bit higher on here, in this area, so this is not a huge problem. Spark table, yep, that looks all pretty good as well. You don't have to use 10 degrees here, depending on how the car is running. You can also use different values, but 10 degrees is a pretty good indicator and pretty good base value. If you, for example, have issues with the transition from 10 degrees to 29 and 30, for example, when you go on part throttle and the car kind of hesitates or something, that might be the transition from 10 degrees to 29 directly. You might need to, or might want to smooth out that a bit, although the engine has room to make that transition by 500 RPM, so it shouldn't be that bad. Also, you don't need 8000 RPM as a limit, because you are only rating to 7300. If you are running high compression, I would highly advise that you use dead cans to determine the maximum timing, because on a high compression engine or higher compression engine, the maximum timing might be a lot lower than you would be used to on a stock compression engine. So I'm not sure if 29 degrees is actually safe or is actually your maximum power. It's probably going to be like 27 degrees, which is the case here. So this might be okay. But again, I would suggest listening to the engine with dead cans to get your maximum out of the table. Everything else looks pretty good. As I said, those cells that look kind of weird are for pops and bangs. So when the timing is retarded to basically after the cylinder reaches top dead center, when the engine fires there, it will create a explosion that also happens when the exhaust valve is already open, and therefore will create pops, bangs and flames in the exhaust. That spark table looks pretty good though. It's very flat and very smooth. Going to the AFR table, that also looks pretty smooth, although I like to go to like 14 AFR on idle, because the cars just tend to idle a bit smoother, and maybe like use something 15 to 15.5 AFR on cruise and part throttle, or right here. This is basically the area when you drive on the highway and want high fuel economy. Then you can put in 15.5 here and tune it for that, for example, or something in that region. And then you will be able to save some fuel. And also, this doesn't need to be as much scaled down. You can go up to 14.7 until here, for example, or even those 15, and then scale it up from here, so that you are at the desired 13 or 12.8 or something on the 96 and 100 kPa value. But other than that, a table like this will work. though it's just not as fuel efficient. Spark settings, that seems okay. I always use cranking advance 10 degrees, but that doesn't really matter much. If the engine is starting good, leave it like that. There's nothing too bad to it. Dual settings is fine if you're using like coil on plugs, because this seems rather low for stock ignition, but I don't know what exactly this car is running. IAT retard, okay, on an NA engine you don't need it really. Cold advance, there's 0. Looking at cranking settings, this looks pretty much fine. Maybe a bit much fuel under when the engine is warm, but if the car starts like this, shouldn't be an issue. And if there's no prime pulse, the primary pulse is quite low, so the cranking fuel being a bit higher makes sense. Warm-up enrichment is also okay, maybe a bit high on here on the 19 degrees, because 40% enrichment is quite a lot. But if the AFRs are like in the 12s or so when starting cold, or maybe even in the 11s, it's fine. If it's richer than that, maybe give it a bit less fuel when warming up. Idle control is open loop, which is fine. So this shouldn't make really much issue. If there is no idle up setup, so if there, for example, if the fan turns on, the idle will kind of drop. I always like to set the temperature, or the max temperature here, to the temperature when my fan turns on. So in this case, this would be 94 degrees, or rather 94 degrees, and it stays on until 90 degrees. So I like to pull this one up to, or put this to 90 degrees, so when the fan stays on, and put that to like 2% over that, because then it can compensate for the fan turning on, because the fan on the engine pulls quite a lot of power, and maybe easier, or then it may be better if you do it like this. I see people that are PW on cranking duty, and so this is basically how much air the intake air control valve lets in when the engine is cranking. This should always be more than the normal idle duty cycle, usually like around double, if that works for you, and if the engine is starting good with that, leave it like this. Idle up is not set up. This is only really needed with AC. You could set up idle advance. So looking at added, it will add ignition angle when, for example, the RPM is too low. So for example, if it is missing 50 RPM, it will add 1 or 2 degrees depending how much you put in there to the timing, and that will increase your RPM, which can be a good thing for controlling idle with open loop, because the idle may sometimes just dip randomly, or if you turn on like your interior fan or something, the idle might fluctuate, or your lights, and you can compensate a bit with this. It's only going to be like 100 to maybe 150 RPM, but it can be done, and it's at least some compensation for electronics being or getting turned on. Launch control is not set up. Fuel pump priming on 2 seconds is fine. Boost control is obviously not set up, as this is an NA car, and anything else should be fine like this. So this tune is pretty good. There were a few things, such as I said, the map value, which were which were kind of weird. Though I have experienced that in a lot of MX-5s, or generally in a lot of ECUs. And just make sure that your vacuum line for the map sensor is connected to the plenum basically, and not to a single runner, because on the MX-5 there are 2 ports for vacuum that are pretty close to a runner and can cause that, and I would suggest not using those and using the one on the left side of the plenum. Yeah, that will solve that issue alongside the map sampling method. That's it for this video. I wish you a nice day, and goodbye.